It was a warm afternoon in the bustling streets of Greenville. Life carried on as usual, with people moving through their routines, some smiling, some hurried, and some lost in their own thoughts. Among the crowd was Isabella, a striking black woman with an air of confidence and grace. She walked with purpose, wearing a simple yet elegant dress that flowed with the rhythm of her steps. Around her neck was a golden chain, its brilliance catching the sunlight. It wasn't just an accessory. It was a symbol of love, a cherished gift from her husband, Charles. As Isabella passed by a row of parked police cruisers, Officer Samuel leaned against one of the cars, sipping his coffee. Samuel was a seasoned cop, but not in the way that garnered respect. His years on the force had bred arrogance rather than wisdom, and he carried himself with an inflated sense of authority. Samuel's uniform, to him, was more than a symbol of duty. It was a license to exert control, often in ways that crossed ethical lines. His prejudices ran deep, and he saw the world in shades of division rather than unity. Samuel's eyes caught the gleam of Isabella's chain, and something about her demeanor irked him. She didn't seem intimidated by his presence, didn't lower her gaze or quicken her steps like others might. Instead, she walked past him without a second glance. To Samuel, it felt like a challenge, as if she were dismissing his authority. His ego bristled. "Hey, you!" he called out sharply, setting his coffee on the hood of the car. Isabella stopped and turned, her brow furrowed in mild confusion. "Yes, officer?" she asked politely, though her voice carried an undertone of caution. Samuel approached her, his expression stern. "That chain around your neck, where'd you get it?" His tone wasn't one of curiosity, but accusation. Isabella blinked, taken aback. "It's mine," she replied calmly. "It was a gift from my husband." Samuel folded his arms, scrutinizing her. "A gift, huh? Looks pretty expensive. Are you sure it's yours? You match the description of someone reported for theft." Isabella's face hardened slightly. "I assure you, officer, I haven't stolen anything. This chain is mine." But Samuel wasn't interested in her explanation. He'd already decided she didn't belong, that her presence and her possession of such a valuable item were suspicious. His biases clouded his judgment, and his sense of authority swelled. "A likely story," he scoffed. "People like you always have excuses." Isabella's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. "People like me?" she asked, her voice tinged with incredulity. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Samuel stepped closer, his posture intimidating. "You know exactly what I mean. Now, I need you to come with me for questioning. We'll sort this out at the station." "I haven't done anything wrong," Isabella said firmly, though her heart raced with frustration. "This is a mistake." Samuel's lips curled into a smirk. "The only mistake here is you thinking you can walk around with stolen jewelry and get away with it. Let's go." Isabella's patience began to wear thin, but she refused to let him see her anger. Instead, she tried reason. "Officer, I'm asking you to think carefully about what you're doing. This chain is mine, and I've done nothing to warrant this treatment. Please don't make a decision you'll regret." But her words only seemed to fuel Samuel's ego. "Regret? Oh, I don't think so. This is fun for me, putting people like you in your place. It's part of the job." Isabella's stomach churned at his words, but she maintained her composure. "I'm warning you," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "You don't know who I am, and you don't know what you're doing." Samuel laughed, a mocking sound that echoed down the street. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing. Now stop stalling." As he reached for his handcuffs, Isabella made a decision. Without drawing attention, she slipped her hand into her pocket and pressed a single button on her phone, dialing her husband, Charles. She didn't speak, didn't give away what she was doing, but she knew Charles would understand. He always did. Samuel, oblivious to the call, clicked the cuffs around her wrists with a sense of triumph. "Let's see how confident you are behind bars," he sneered. Isabella said nothing as he led her to his cruiser. She sat in the back seat, her expression calm, her mind racing. She knew this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin, and she knew Charles would be listening, his quiet fury building with every word. At the station, Samuel paraded Isabella inside as if he'd caught a notorious criminal. He ignored the questioning looks from his colleagues, too wrapped up in his own sense of power. As he processed her arrest, he continued his barrage of insults, belittling her at every turn. "You should be grateful I'm not pressing more charges," he said, leaning against the desk. "Your attitude doesn't match your status. People like you should learn their place." Isabella met his gaze with unwavering calm. "You're making a mistake," she said again. "But don't worry, you'll understand soon enough." Samuel laughed, a cruel, hollow sound. "We'll see about that." Unbeknownst to him, Charles was already on his way. At the police station, the air was tense, but Isabella remained composed. She sat quietly in the holding cell, her posture upright and dignified, as if the bars around her couldn't contain her spirit. The station was bustling with activity. Officers going about their business, filing reports, taking calls, and responding to emergencies. Yet amidst this controlled chaos, Isabella's presence seemed to radiate an unshakable calm. She was far from the first person to find themselves unjustly behind bars, but she carried herself as though she were already free. Samuel, meanwhile, was reveling in his small moment of perceived power. He leaned casually against his desk, smirking to himself as he recounted the arrest to a colleague. "She thought she could talk her way out of it," he said, shaking his head. "But I put her in her place. People like her need to understand that this isn't their playground." The other officer raised an eyebrow, clearly uncomfortable with Samuel's tone. "What exactly did she do?" he asked hesitantly. Samuel waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, she was wearing some expensive chain, probably stolen. When I asked her about it, she got all defensive. A typical." "Did she resist?" the officer pressed. "No," Samuel admitted, his smirk faltering slightly. "But you can tell the type. Arrogant, acting like they're better than us." The officer nodded slowly, though it was clear he wasn't convinced. He glanced toward the holding cell where Isabella sat with quiet dignity, and then back at Samuel. "Are you sure about this?" "Of course I'm sure," Samuel snapped, his ego flaring. "Don't start questioning me now." In the meantime, Isabella's phone call was already setting events in motion. Charles, her husband and the police captain, was driving toward the station with a sense of purpose. He had heard the entire exchange between Isabella and Samuel, his jaw tightening with every word. Charles wasn't just angry, he was deeply disappointed. This wasn't the kind of behavior he tolerated in his precinct, and it certainly wasn't something he would overlook when it involved his own wife. When Charles arrived at the station, he didn't burst in with dramatic flair. Instead, he walked in calmly, his uniform crisp and his badge gleaming. His presence commanded respect, and the officers around him straightened instinctively as he entered. He didn't say a word at first, simply scanning the room until his eyes landed on Samuel, who was still smugly recounting his story. "Samuel," Charles said evenly, his voice carrying an authority that turned heads. Samuel looked up, startled. "Captain, I didn't know you were coming in today." "I wasn't," Charles replied, his tone steady but cold. "But I heard something on my way home that I felt needed my immediate attention." Samuel shifted uncomfortably under Charles's gaze, suddenly aware that something was off. What's that, sir?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Charles didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked past Samuel, heading straight for the holding cells. When he reached Isabella's cell, his expression softened, though his jaw was still tight with restrained anger. "Isabella," he said gently, his voice now warmed and familiar. "Are you all right?" Isabella rose to her feet, her calm demeanor unwavering. "I'm fine, Charles," she replied, "though I do think you need to have a word with one of your officers." Charles turned back to Samuel, his expression hardening once more. "Samuel," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade, "why is my wife in a cell?" The room fell silent. Samuel's face drained of color as the realization hit him like a freight train. "Your wife?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Charles said sharply, "my wife, The woman you arrested for no legitimate reason." Samuel's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. I thought... she was acting suspicious and the chain..." "Don't," Charles interrupted, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't try to justify this. I heard everything, every word you said. Do you have any idea how disgraceful your behavior was?" Samuel's legs felt weak, and he nearly stumbled as he took a step back. "Captain, No," Charles cut him off. "Save your excuses. You've shown me exactly who you are, and let me tell you something. You don't deserve to wear that badge." The room was silent, the weight of Charles's words hanging heavy in the air. Other officers exchanged uneasy glances, none of them daring to speak. "I'm suspending you," Charles continued, his voice steady but filled with authority. "Effective immediately. You're to turn in your badge and your gun before you leave this building. And before you even think about returning, you're going to attend anti-racism training and therapy. 6 months minimum." Samuel's knees buckled, and he dropped to the floor, his head bowed. "Captain, please," he begged. "I made a mistake. I'll change. Please don't do this." Charles's eyes narrowed. "You think this is about me? This is about you. About the way you've treated people, my wife included. You've disrespected the very uniform you claim to honor." "Please," Samuel whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Give me another chance." It was Isabella who spoke next, her voice calm but firm. "Charles," she said, stepping forward, "let him go through the training and therapy. Maybe he'll learn, maybe he'll change. But don't take away his chance to prove himself." Charles looked at her, his expression softening once more. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Isabella said with a nod. "If we don't give him a chance, how will he ever learn?" Charles sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Fine," he said, turning back to Samuel. "You have 6 months to prove that you can change. If you fail, you're done. Understood?" Samuel nodded frantically, his face still streaked with tears. "Yes, sir, thank you, sir. And Mom, I promise I'll change." Charles unlocked the cell and helped Isabella out. He escorted her to the car, his protective arm around her shoulders. As they drove home, the tension in his body began to ease, though his anger toward Samuel lingered. "You handled that well," Charles said finally, glancing at Isabella. "Better than I would have." Isabella smiled faintly. "People like Samuel don't need hatred. They need education. And maybe, just maybe, he'll become a better person because of this." Charles reached over and squeezed her hand. "You're incredible, you know that?" Isabella chuckled softly. "I've had a good teacher." As they pulled into the driveway of their home, Isabella felt a sense of relief. She stepped out of the car, inhaling the crisp evening air. Charles opened the door for her, and they walked inside together, leaving the chaos of the day behind them. Samuel's suspension marked the beginning of a 6-month odyssey that would change him in ways he never imagined. After the initial humiliation of turning in his badge and gun, he was sent to an anti-racism camp and therapy sessions as part of his disciplinary measures. These programs were intense, designed to confront participants with the harsh realities of systemic racism, personal bias, and the impact of their actions. For Samuel, it was like being stripped bare and forced to face the parts of himself he'd always ignored or denied. The first session at the camp was a group meeting. Samuel sat in a circle with people from diverse backgrounds, each sharing their experiences with racism, prejudice, and injustice. A black woman named Sandra spoke about being denied opportunities despite her qualifications. A young Latino man, Hector, shared how his father was deported despite living in the country for over 20 years. Samuel listened, at first skeptical, but gradually their stories began to resonate with him. When it was Samuel's turn to speak, he hesitated. "I don't know where to start," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I've always felt like I was just doing my job. But hearing all of this, it makes me wonder if I've been blind." Sandra gave him a hard look. "It's not about being blind," she said. "It's about choosing not to see." Her words struck Samuel like a thunderclap. He realized that his actions hadn't just been a result of ignorance, but a deliberate choice to dismiss the humanity of others. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it marked the beginning of his transformation. In therapy, Samuel was confronted with his own upbringing. His therapist, a gentle but firm woman named Dr. Patel, asked probing questions about his childhood, his family, and the values he was raised with. "Samuel," she said during one session, "why do you think you felt justified in arresting Isabella that day?" Samuel fidgeted in his seat. "I don't know," he muttered. Maybe because I thought I had the right to. I thought I was doing my job." Dr. Patel nodded. "And what about the things you said to her, calling her arrogant, telling her to know her place? Were those part of your job too?" Samuel's face burned with shame. "No," he admitted. That was me. My own biases." "Good," Dr. Patel said. "Acknowledging that is the first step, but understanding why you felt that way is what will help you change." Over weeks of therapy, Samuel began to unpack the roots of his prejudice. He realized that much of it stemmed from his father, a man who had often used racial slurs and made derogatory remarks about people of color. Samuel had absorbed those attitudes without question, carrying them into adulthood and into his work. One day, Dr. Patel asked him to write a letter, not to Isabella or Captain Charles, but to himself. "Write to the version of you who arrested Isabella," she said. "Tell him what you've learned." It was a humbling exercise. Samuel wrote about the pain he had caused, the dignity he had stripped from others, and the ways he had failed, not just as a police officer, but as a human being. When he read the letter aloud in his next session, his voice broke and tears streamed down his face. "I didn't realize how much harm I was doing," he said. "I thought I was just enforcing the law, but I was enforcing my own biases." By the end of the 6 months, Samuel was a changed man. He returned to the precinct, nervous but determined. Captain Charles was waiting for him, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Well," Charles said, his tone neutral, "what do you have to say for yourself?" Samuel took a deep breath. "I'm sorry," he began. "Not just to you and Isabella, but to everyone I've wronged. I've spent these months learning, really learning, about the damage I've done. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to be better. I want to make things right." Charles studied him for a long moment. "And how do I know you're not just saying what I want to hear?" Samuel hesitated. "You don't," he admitted. "But I can show you. Give me a chance, and I'll prove that I've changed." Charles nodded slowly. "We'll see. You're on probation. One misstep, and you're out for good." Samuel nodded, relief flooding through him. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." As part of his probation, Samuel volunteered to lead anti-racism workshops for new recruits. He shared his story openly, admitting his mistakes and the lessons he had learned. His honesty resonated with many, and over time, he began to earn back the trust of his colleagues. But the most meaningful moment came a few weeks later, when Charles invited Samuel and Isabella to dinner. Samuel was nervous, unsure of how Isabella would react. When he arrived, Isabella greeted him with a warm smile. "I hear you've been doing good work," she said. "I'm trying," Samuel replied. "Thanks to you." During dinner, they talked about everything: Samuel's journey, Isabella's experiences, and Charles's hopes for the future of the precinct. By the end of the evening, Samuel felt a sense of closure he hadn't thought possible. As he left, Isabella said, "Remember, Samuel, this is just the beginning. Change isn't a one-time thing. It's something you have to keep working at." Samuel nodded. "I will," he promised. Over the years, Samuel became a vocal advocate for diversity and inclusion within the police force. He mentored new recruits, ensuring that they understood the importance of empathy and respect. His journey from a racist cop to a champion of equality became a story of hope and redemption. And true to Isabella's words, Samuel never stopped working on himself. He attended community events, listened to the stories of marginalized groups, and used his position to make positive changes. In the end, Samuel's transformation wasn't just about him. It was about the lives he touched along the way. Isabella's act of forgiveness had set off a ripple effect, proving that even the most broken people could find redemption if given the chance. As Samuel stood at a precinct ceremony years later, receiving an award for his contributions to community relations, he looked out at the crowd. Among them were Charles and Isabella, smiling proudly. Samuel's voice cracked as he accepted the award. "I owe everything to the people who believed I could change," he said. "And to those who didn't give up on me, even when I didn't deserve it. Thank you for giving me a second chance." The applause was thunderous, but for Samuel, the real reward was knowing that he had finally become the person he was meant to be.